All right, joining us now. She is someone that I've known for a while. We reconnected from our day when I was back covering CUSA in depth when I was UCF broadcaster. UCF was in CUSA. She was in charge of softball. She's still in charge of softball now on a grander stage. She's the committee chairperson this season for the softball committee, or person part of the in CUSA. I speak of Kelly Gatwood, joining us kindly now here on In the Circle. How you doing, friend?
I'm doing great, Eric. It's great to be back with you and having a conversation about softball.
The best thing is you haven't aged at all. I have, so props to you. You're doing fine since we hung out last night in Tulsa for the CUSA tournament in 2013.
There you go. I
Props.
appreciate that.
Yeah, you're doing good. So let's talk. We got so many things. Obviously, I know you got precious time. First of all, take us through what's it like for you right now, because I think the first thing that I think we got to make clear is people always focus on the committee on the last week of during conference championship weeks or the last week of the season, but the work starts way before that. So for the audience that's tuning in, just give us an idea of what's it like right now and some of the process and some of the work that you all are already doing as you're constantly working to get ready for that final selection Sunday.
Yeah, absolutely. The work definitely starts far before that selections weekend. We start watching games on that opening weekend of play. As we know, the eye test is super important. Kind of funny, our 2-year-old daughter even knows when the TV comes on that mommy's probably turning softball on. So it's definitely the thing that's on the most in our household. But we start off, we do an RPI webinar about a month into the season, and we get all of our regional advisory committee members on that call, walk them through the process, how selections work, what criteria we use, what makes up the RPI, kind of give them a process on how to utilize the RPI system, all the columns that are within there, and just really get them comfortable with that. And then that following week, we start regional advisory committee calls. And so we're divided into 5 regions, and we have at least one national committee member within each of those regions. Some have more than one. And all of the conferences are divided up within those regions. And we have a coach that represents each conference within those regions. So, they're able to get on. They spend a lot of time ahead of time creating their top 10 rankings, who they feel like should be on the watch list. And then we also give them an opportunity to tell us anything that they think is important about their conference members. They're out playing those teams day in and day out. We watch a lot of games, but we can't watch every game. So those conversations that we have with them are so important. We take that into selections weekend. So we have about 4 calls, and then in those same weeks, we have our national calls and our ranking calls, and we get on and each region reports out with their top 10. We kind of defend our top 10, why we think teams should be ranked where they are. And so all of those conversations really assist us when we get to selections, where it's just 3 days that we have to select these 64 teams, where we have a little better idea of how to sort them. So our work definitely starts way further in advance than selections weekend. We spend a lot of time vetting through these teams, so that takes a little bit of load off of us when it comes, time to actually select the teams.
You were part of the committee a year ago with Sandy Atkins was at the chair. And I would say overwhelmingly got a positive feedback. I would say maybe the most positive feedback that any committee has gotten in recent years. There's always going to be somebody that will always nitpick something, seating, whatever that happened. But for the most part, mostly positive feedback. You were a part of that. So number one, what kind of feedback did you get? That similar type feedback? Did you get that since then? And how really pleased a lot of people, coaches, fans were with the overall work from last year? And was there something that you took away from maybe last year specifically that you're going to remind yourself as now the committee chairperson to make sure you apply this year to try to have similar, result to the point where everybody seems to give you positive feedback and pleased with the work?
Sure. Yeah, we did. We definitely did receive a lot of great feedback, and no pressure for me this year. So it's definitely in the forefront. But I think one thing that we really focused on is total body of work. Not one component of the RPI takes precedent over another. So everything matters. Obviously, you're going to have instances where you may have to have something that will differentiate a team from another, just when teams are really close. But you look at the total body of work that they've done throughout the season and keep that consistent as you're looking at the teams. And that's something that we did last year. It was a main focus. We've got 10 committee members, so we keep each other accountable as we're going through evaluating all these teams, just trying to apply all of the same principles, everything that's involved. And so that's really important. So it's definitely, being in the leadership role this year, that is something that I've thought about a lot. We have, a lot of different backgrounds from ADs, SWAs, people who are in academic, student athlete support, and then myself in a conference office. And so you've got a lot of backgrounds that you're trying to put together for one common goal. And so that's probably one of the biggest challenges being in the seat I am in, is just trying to get everybody on the same page. So it's a balance of making sure everyone feels heard, that everyone feels comfortable to share, and that's how we get better and we get things right.
Did you talk to Sandy, who maybe gave you some advice? What's it like in this chair versus the previous chair you've had the last few years?
Oh, yes. I mean, it's drastically different. I think one of the biggest differences for me is just the sense of responsibility I feel and the weight of representing our committee, just like I'm having the conversation with you today, just trying to represent us well. And so it's a lot different than just being a committee member. But it's a role that I've enjoyed. It's really great growth for my career. I work in a conference office right now. So, it's something that I do on the daily, working with ADs, SWAs, and coaches groups, and just trying to get everybody on the same page. So this is just more of a centralized focus where it's softball championship. I'm excited to be the chair. I played softball in college. I coached for a year. I currently work with our softball coaches in Conference USA, and this game has just given so much to me. And so it's really full circle for me to be able to be in this position and give back to the game. That has really ultimately shaped who I am. I grew up going to Women's College World Series with my dad, dreamed of being on that stage. So I know how important everything we do is for these coaches and student athletes. And so it's not a job we take lightly, and it's something that we spend a lot of time and have a lot of fun. But some of my best friends are current or former committee members. So it's a really great opportunity, and not one that you're probably going to get very often at this point in my career.
Is that something you've noticed too? When I talked to Sandy, and even Matt Larson brought this up when I spoke to him 2 years ago, that the room now, and this sounds kind of weird to say, because you would think it's common that there's softball people in the room. In other words, there's softball fans. Like you all like Sandy even told me that you all like talking softball. Like even if you weren't in the committee, but you were hanging out, you would be talking softball. And that's not always been the case many years ago. Do you sense that? Because you just mentioned, I'm glad you brought it up. You were a former player. You were a former coach, I believe, as well. You've been, and and that's how we know each other, is because you've been involved with softball in CUSA for a long time, since you arrived in Conference USA in 2009. You've helped run the conference tournaments. You've seen it all. Do you sense that in the room, that you're around a bunch of softball people, and that helps the process in a nutshell, because you're constantly digesting, you're watching all of this, you're observing all these teams, whereas maybe 15, 20 some years ago, you had maybe some people involved that didn't know softball, but somebody had to do the job.
Yes, for sure. I think that is definitely an accurate statement. I say we watch a lot of games in our household, but I watched a lot of games before I was on the committee. I just really enjoy the sport. And I think that is something that's very evident. And I think it's a sign that our sport is growing. People want to be involved in softball. How do I get on that committee? Reaching out to conference offices, in order to be able to try to get on these committees. And so I think that's certainly a sign of how much our sport is growing. We have a ton of television presence, and I think that's evident in what you're seeing in the committee. And certainly there is a ton of softball background that is has been, within committee members in the past that I've served with and currently.
And I remember Matt Larson in 2021, which you were part of that. That was a unique year, trying to figure out that selection process because you had a little bit of everything. You had certain conferences that didn't play non-conference. It was just a little bit all over the place, not a normal season. But yet, and one of the things he said he highlighted to the committee that year is eye test. More than ever before, you got to watch these games because a lot of the metrics maybe are not as off. And Sandy said she took from that and reminded all of you last year. Just talk about that because there is more ways to watch softball. So, you have the metrics, you have RPI, you have the data points, your things you have, but there is, hey, I can watch this team play either live or on archive to confirm what my thoughts are and maybe see how much is that helpful too now with all the access you have to watch games.
Yeah, that year was an interesting year. It was
Yeah.
my first real year on
Welcome.
the committee. When the championship was canceled, that was my first year. So I didn't get to go through that first year as an experience. So the following year in that room was really overwhelming for me, just trying to take it all in for the first time. But yeah, it was an interesting year. And we certainly did have to rely on eye tests because there were games that were canceled. Teams didn't have as many opportunities as they normally did, that were, all things that were out of their control. There were budget restrictions. Teams couldn't travel out of state, things like that. So it was definitely a unique year, but the eye test is something, it's really important. And again, like I said, the growth of our game has given us the tools to help us be successful in selecting these teams because we are able to turn on the TV and we can watch almost every game that is being played in some way. We have access to ESPN Plus and Flow Softball and, all the conferences that don't broadcast on ESPN Plus, they send us logins to watch their games. So we have access to all of it to be able to watch what we need to watch. And so I'm super grateful for that because it has really helped us in the process of selecting the teams for postseason.
Let's talk about some of the things you all have to deal with. Obviously, there's more parity in the game than ever before, which is a good thing. The problem is that makes your job harder because more than ever before, and especially this year, there are more quote unquote upsets. Teams beating teams that some people might be surprised, which obviously on the resume, etc. So, and a lot of resumes are very similar, whether it be about hosting, whether it's about an at-large selection. So just give us an idea of what are some of the things as you all as committee will look at that's important. Because you mentioned it's not just an RPI. There's a few other things. I know scheduling, non-conference, who you schedule is a factor. I know other factors include, are you beating teams you're supposed to be? But this is unique because every year there's more parity and there's more teams to pick from, which is good for the overall sport, but makes your job a lot harder, quite honestly.
There is no doubt about that. We've had a couple of interesting weekends these past 2 weekends. So definitely evident, definitely something that we're going to have to look at on selections weekend. But we have, quite a bit of criteria that we follow, that we look at when we're comparing teams that are really close and maybe they've beat up, on each other head to head, whatever it may be. So those criteria, strength of schedule is super important. The intent to schedule, what you're doing outside of those conference games, what you can control, what you're doing with what you can control, that's really important. Significant wins and losses we look at. Results versus common opponents is one. So, there's a tool in our system where we can pull teams and look at their results versus common opponents. Which is also, very important as well. So head-to-head competition, as I had mentioned. So there are things that we can look at within, the components of the RPI that will help us differentiate teams.
You obviously work at Conference USA. You're an associate AD, long time. I'm curious, couple things. Number one, what's one thing that you've learned since being on the committee that you didn't know prior? Because obviously when you're on the outside looking in, you probably have some thoughts like, I don't know about that. I don't know if I agree with that. But now you're in it and you probably learned some things you didn't know going in and you're like, oh, okay, this makes more sense. What are some things you've learned? Because you have a unique position in that you work in a conference. Sandy worked is at Troy, Matt Larson in North Dakota State. So they have one institution. You are part of a whole conference.
Right. Yeah. So, we have a pretty good understanding being in a conference office just with, one of our roles in being a liaison to a sport is to help them learn how to schedule non-conference to put themselves in a position for an at-large bid. So I have a lot of these conversations already with our coaches prior to being on the committee, but since joining the committee, I think one thing that has been pretty evident is how hard it is to separate these teams. I mean, there are so many really good softball teams. And so, and that's something that I mentioned a little earlier is the total body of work and being consistent with that. And that's when that becomes so important. But I think that's probably the biggest thing I've learned. And, just being in the weeds of it a little more and being on this side has certainly educated me. So hopefully I can be of a better resource for our teams moving forward in Conference USA to help us position ourselves for at-large bids.
The other thing, and I know about this, but it's worth just bringing up for the audience that might wonder, and it's not just applied to you, but other people in the committee. For example, in your situation, anytime a Conference USA team will come up, you got to leave the room. So just explain how that works. We'll use you as the example, but there are other examples within the committee when either a particular team or a particular whatever comes up, certain people have to leave the room. So how does that work within that process?
Yeah, so I mean, the confidentiality of the committee is really important, and so in my specific case, I'm in the conference office. So anytime any of our 11 members are brought up in the room to discuss, I will have to step out. They'll have the conversation, and when they get done, I can come in, and that applies to anyone at an institution. Just a little bit different in my case because it applies to all the teams that are in Conference USA. So yeah, and it's really just to protect the conversation so people feel comfortable sharing whatever it is that they want to about the team without the representative sitting right there listening or, staring you down about what you're saying about their team. So that's really why that's in place.
No question about that. Let's also address a couple other myths or whatever. The top 16 hosts. Geography has no bearing to it. Just kind of confirm that there is no, hey, this team can bust certain teams, so let's put them as a host. That is not the case. Sandy Atkinson played that. You're trying to pick the 16 best teams to host. So take us through that process on trying to figure out who are the 16 most deserving teams. And also the other myth is you're not really focused so much on the facilities. That's other people's concern. Your goal is to try to get the 16 top seeds. Just to kind of expand on that.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we choose the 16 seeds based on their ability and their total body of work throughout the season, what they've done, what they've shown. All of the facility piece, that is all done in advance. The NCAA staff does a great job in reaching out to people who could potentially be a host to make sure they've submitted their bid to host, and we have a facility scorecard that we follow. So those are kind of the minimum requirements that they need to meet. And so this year we've put together a focus working group within our committee that is focused on that. And really the goal is in that committee is to say, okay, what is happening at other facilities that may impact the student athlete experience that's not happening at another facility. So just trying to create a comparable experience for all student athletes. And so wherever a facility may be falling short, all of that's taken care of in advance. So the discussion of facilities does not even come up when we're talking about the 1 through 16.
No, it's good. The other one I want to mention also, the 400-mile radius, that is an NCAA thing. That is not a committee thing. That is not, because I want to make sure people know this. This is not Kelly Gatwood saying, we got to put them in 400 miles. No, you're following, right, the procedures, what the NCAA mandates. Just to kind of expand on that, because some people have this idea that the committee's doing it, but no, it's the NCAA is doing it. And I've had, other committees like, yeah, it'd be a lot easier if we didn't have that, but that's under the parameters that we're working on.
Yeah, we'd love to not have that in. I mean, this is something that's been, in the conversation for I think several years now, and it's really kind of finally catching some legs. Women's volleyball and women's soccer use it as a pilot program this last fall, but seating 32 teams, so that's 50% of the field. And so, the goal there is to create a more balanced bracket where, as you mentioned, we kind of have our hands tied right now with that 400-mile radius travel restriction. So our hope is, we see the 1 through 16 and those are separated. But now we would have an opportunity for 17 through 32 to be a little more strategic in how those are placed. And they would go into those top 16 sites where they really truly should be.
Sure.
So, we've got a lot of bracketing policies that go into place where we have conference matchups. We're supposed to try to avoid any conference matchups. And then that 400-mile radius that plays a big part. We just can't create a flight if it's not needed. And so, in the pilot program that was taking place in the fall, if it created a flight, then that was okay. And so just having that flexibility would allow us to create a lot more balanced bracket and not have our hands tied as much. And that's the goal with that pilot program.
Well, and let's expand a little bit, because you mentioned that. I've heard about that. Going to 32 seeds, as you mentioned, for those that not be aware, volleyball, women's soccer did that. I like your term, pilot, basically try by there. What is the chatter? Do you believe that will be a part of softball in the future? Is that one of those where it's going to be discussed and depend on the feedback that volleyball? Where are we with that? Is that something that we could be seeing on the horizon as far as softball going to 32?
Yeah, we hope so. The softball committee has expressed our support for that. We feel like it'd be really good for our sport. So, that's kind of moving through the necessary channels. And so we certainly hope. So, we've provided our support. And so now it's kind of a wait and see. But again, it would just allow us to be a little more prescriptive with those 17 to 32 and how those teams are placed. And I feel like, one of the main complaints we hear when the bracket goes out is all related to that 400-mile radius. So I think, it probably certainly would still be in play, but it would just give us a little more flexibility, at least for 50% of the bracket.
Right. Whereas the other 50%, maybe we still would apply the 400-mile radius, but you're talking at that point, the two bottom seeds of each regional, in theory, whereas, the 1 versus 2 seeds, as you mentioned, in a particular regional, obviously there would be some matchups there that people are like, whoa, I can't believe that's happening. Oh, wow, is that happening again? Do you think next year, 2 years, is that where, or is it depending on what volleyball and soccer's feedback is, which I know is ongoing, it's fluid?
Yeah, and I think the feedback has all been really great from those committees.
Okay.
I think it was really great from the coaches and student athletes as well. But, there's necessary channels it has to go through to get approval. And so we're just kind of in a position where the committee definitely supports it. And so we just wait and see how that process will unfold in the coming years.
But that's important what you just highlighted. That's not a committee's decision. I think some people think it's a committee's decision. That's not. It's above you in that regard. You can make the suggestion, but others have to make that call, correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay. No, thanks for clearing it up, because I think a lot of people didn't know that. From that standpoint, what's it like? When you're dealing with at-large teams, or whether it be a hosting team, is there one or the other that creates more chatter internally? Is there what's the most challenging part of the job? Is it figuring out who should be in the field? Is it who should host? I know every year is different, but take me through that, because I'm sure there's a lot of conversations. I'm sure there's quite frankly, some disagreements, arguments that eventually have to be settled. Just take us through it, because that's unique. Because I know in your case, that a lot of institutions, are depending on, these decisions in a lot of ways. So what is that process like, and what's more challenging than any one or particular?
Yeah, it's all challenging, to be honest with you. I don't think there's one thing that's more challenging than another. I think what people don't realize is there's 64 teams, but 32 of those are automatic qualifiers. So we only have control over 32 teams, which is about 10% of all Division I softball teams. So it's a really, really small number that you're looking at. And so the impact that our decisions have on student athletes and coaches, it's big, and we know that, and we're aware of it. And the decisions we make aren't, taken lightly. We spend a lot of time, as I've said, throughout the season, really vetting through these teams and making sure we're not missing anything. And then obviously for selections weekend is when all of that comes together. But it's all challenging, and it's challenging because we know the weight that it carries. Every decision we make.
Men's basketball and women's basketball. Men's basketball, I will bring up because CUSA had a very successful postseason. Congratulations in advance
Thank you very much.
With the incredible run in the NCAA, NIT, etc. I mean, it was pretty remarkable. Great year for the league on there. Basketball, as you know, goes by the net rankings, not the RPI. They decided that a few years back, various reasons. I guess I bring that up because I'm wondering from a softball standpoint, is there been talk about replacing the RPI or complementing the RPI with some other metrics, if not already? Considering basketball kind of did away with it, has there been any chatter about the RPI? Because that's always you're always going to have people that like it. They're always going to have people that don't like it. That's just the way it is. But I'm curious, what's been the chatter as far as the RPI is concerned and helping you guys make the selections?
Sure. I mean, and the committee's been open to other metrics, certainly. I think in addition to the RPI. So with the KPI, it's Kevin Paga, which I think you're familiar with.
I had him on the show. Yep.
So we had a presentation from him in our annual meeting last year, and he has great information. I think kind of where the committee is right now, we are open to other metrics. We're open to other, statistical data that may be able to help us differentiate teams. We, talked about this at convention and kind of put it out there for the coaches, but there's certainly, there's a lot of coaches that struggle with the RPI as it is, and how to schedule and figuring out the balance of creating a non-conference schedule for the strength of your team and putting yourself in a position where you can be selected as an at-large. So we certainly don't want to prematurely introduce anything that we feel like is not going to be a lot different. And so just continuing to have ongoing conversations about it, just to see what is best for our sport, and not introducing something too early that would cause more disruption than help for what we're trying to do. In the KPI presentation we received, a lot of numbers were similar. There's certainly a little different because he puts weight on certain things that are different than RPI. So that's kind of where the committee is on different metrics right now.
What's the most common question that coaches, when you talk to them in conventions what's the most common question they ask?
I think it's really focused on what goes on within the RPI, and if there's a component that carries more weight. Is it head to head that's more important? Is it strength of schedule that's more important? Is it my bad loss versus my good win? Or do good wins or bad losses matter more in the first of the season versus the last of the season? And the answer is all those things matter, and all of those things we take into account. Not just one singled out component. So those are the things, the education piece is really important. So that opportunity that the NFCA allows us to go and speak to all Division I coaches at convention is really important. We spend a lot of time talking to them about the conversations we're having within the committee, what we're trying to do to change. We've done a lot of work with the NFCA in the past couple of years, and just relying on them to help us. They put out surveys, so we get coaches' feedback before we make any type of decision. And I think that's been really important because it affects them the most. So their voice matters a lot in the decisions that we make.
It'll never be perfect. You're always going to have a coach that's upset. My team, didn't get a fair shake, et cetera, et cetera. But do you feel the relationship with the coaches and the committee now is better than it was, say, maybe 10 years ago or 12 years ago? Do you think it's gotten better and improved? It'll never be perfect. You're always going to have somebody's upset and things like that. It's an emotional. They're fighting for their players. You get all that. But I feel like we're in a better place today than we were, say, 5-6 years ago. Am I right on, or am I reaching?
I agree with you, and I sure would hope so. I hope that the coaches feel heard, and I think the collaboration that we've had with the NFCA in working with them. They work with the coaches all the time. They know what the coaches are saying, the complaints they have, positive feedback they have. So all of those things are really important. And so as we're having conversations at our annual meeting and talking about changes, there's a lot of things that we say, you know what, it'd be really great to have coaches feedback before we make this decision. And that's what we've been doing. So just trying to be a little more transparent in that space where we want to hear how you feel and we want to know your feedback because it's important to us, and really just trying to be and have our ears open at Women's College World Series and hearing the feedback from those coaches. Just always trying to make our sport better. And that's really the goal for everybody involved.
When it comes to scheduling, because I've heard this all the time from coaches and fans reach out, what do you tell a team that maybe can't control, for example, a conference opponent that's having a tough year, but that they're going to have to play them 3 times, and that's going to hurt their schedule strength formula, whereas maybe other teams don't have that issue there. How do you explain on that? And some coaches have even said, hey, I played this certain team in the non-conference thinking they were really good. Maybe they had some injuries early. They're a different team now than they were earlier. There's a lot of things to kind of pick there that's not simple. So how do you kind of handle all that as a committee?
There are, and that's not a job I envy in coaches that have to, guess how a team's going to be when they're putting them on a schedule 2 years in advance or more, whatever it may be. People have down years, people have injuries, and that affects your schedule. And certainly, to speak to the conference piece, you have to control what you can control. And so, the intent to schedule is a really big one, and that will affect your strength of schedule. So, if you have a conference that's having a down year, but you have to play those games, you just need to go out and win those games. And that's the best that you can do. In all the data that we review and look at, it will tell us what a non-conference game is highlighted different than a conference game. And so we know that, and that differentiates us, for us. So all of those things are, those types of conversations that I have with coaches, to say, look, you can control what you can control. Your non-conference, you can control. Your conference, you can't. So you have to do the best you can with both and try to find that balance based on the strength of your team.
And that's a great point you just brought up, and I think it's worth mentioning again. Non-conference, you can control. That is why over the years, you and people that have been in your same, literally your chair, have brought up non-conference scheduling for particular reasons, either on a positive or a quote negative perception, because that you can control. You cannot control your conference. We understand that, but you can control to some extent the non-conference. Now, some teams may not have played out the way you thought, but there are certain things. Hey, go out and play a tough non-conference schedule, which I feel has been the most consistent message that the committee has sent out for the most part over the years, is try to play a tough, challenge yourself in the non-conference, try to get those quality wins. Don't just depend on your conference, because the conferences now are so different now it's growing by year. So there's more and more imbalanced conference schedules, which you also have to kind of go through, correct? Which is now another layer to the challenges that you have.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that is a consistent message that we say, because it's very true. And intent to schedule and strength of schedule are 2 really big components, within the RPI that we look at. So we know you don't have a lot of control over your conference, and that's just a given, especially as conferences grows. You're not going to play every team in your conference. So you may have a year where your conference is really strong, but you may not play the top 3 teams in your conference. So that's something that you have to look at. Okay, in my non-conference schedule, I probably need to schedule a little stronger. And so that ahead of time, where you may, be playing the top teams in your conference. And so maybe you can schedule a little different. But again, it's that balance of where the strength of your team is, and also
Sure.
meeting the over 500 criteria that you have to meet as well. So
Right.
all of those things come into play.
I'll ask you, this is another popular question, so people get mad at me if I don't ask. Head to head, how much of a factor that is, whether it's picking between 2 teams for a hosting spot or a seed, or even at large, how much is head to head a factor? Where does that fall in this process?
Yeah, it's just another selection criteria we use. So we don't weight head to head, more than another component. Certainly, I think when we're talking about two teams that are really good or three teams that are really good, and there's not a lot that separates them, that head to head component could really help us separate them. If they're pretty even on all other aspects, they're even on their total body of work, we've got to look at something that will differentiate them for us. And so head to head would be something that we would look at in a case like that.
Not to think too far ahead, but I mean, the elephant in the room is obviously there's a lot of realignment in college athletics these days. You quite aware of it. The only reason I ask is, do you think this will affect the committee down the road? Because you're going to have new teams in different conferences, so maybe certain matchups that we normally would see in a regional maybe can't happen. Larger conferences, as we talked about, do you think it'll be more of a challenge for the committees moving forward because of all the changes? Could you see some tweaks happening that may have to be addressed or discussed because of all the changes that's going on in college athletics?
I certainly think it can be a factor, and I think we're already seeing it in some of the bigger conferences right now that don't play everyone. And so it already is a factor. And so we have, as we talked about, some of those bracketing, principles in place that keep us from putting teams in regions to prevent the conference matchups, but they may have never even played each other in conference play. So I think as the conferences continue to grow and get bigger, and they may not be able to play everyone in conference, I think it's certainly something that could become a factor. And it may be something that we have to be provided a little bit of flexibility on, because if the conferences continue to grow, we may not be able to put together a regional without a conference matchup. So it's certainly something that we've had discussions on, and we are keeping in the forefront as college athletics continues to evolve and change.
And I think it's a good point you bring up about the imbalanced schedule, because I know in years past some fans might get confused. Wait a minute, that team finished ahead of that team in the conference, but that team in particular got picked over that team. But as you pointed out, part of that is more than likely in part because of the imbalanced schedules. One may have had a tougher conference schedule than the other. Plus, there's other variables, which goes back to like non-conference schedule. Who did you beat? Who have you played? So people can't get married too much, even though it's kind of weird because we're always told you got to do well in conference. Yes, but that's that's not the only end all be all. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. I mean, and I think a lot of people get caught up in conference standings as well, and that's something that we're very aware of. Yeah, it may be the conference standings, but one team that may be at the top didn't play, the other top three teams within the conference, and that could change a lot. So, there's a lot of conferences out there currently right now that don't play everyone. So while we look, conference standings could be a tool that we use, it's definitely not something that, as you said, that we're married to, because you have those elements in there where they may not play everyone that's in their conference. So it could be a little skewed.
And that's something I've learned, honestly, in talking over in the last few years. I did not know this going in, because that's what I've always been told. We don't, when I ask about a conference champion versus an at-large team in the same conference and why an at-large team is seated higher than a conference champion, and the answer I've got was, we don't look at it as conference champion in this or that from the standpoint of all of this is part of the overall body of work. And that's the only way you can do it, because everybody has different schedules. It's not like pro sports where you're playing everybody and you could maybe go win-loss and stuff like that. There's a lot more complicated now in conferences, where some conferences don't play everybody. Some conferences have a more, a limited amount of scheduling. So there's a lot of variables that you can't just say, well, that team won a certain conference, so they should be ahead of this particular team when that team maybe had a tougher road. And not to put words in your mouth, but that is part of the challenge, correct? That's why when we see some of that, and some people get kind of questioned about it, that's part of the reason why you don't do that, because it just makes it's a very complicated process, and that's the only best way to do it, is the overall body of work.
That's exactly right. And that is, I know it's a really common term that you will hear committee members utilize, but all of those reasons that you just stated are exactly why it's so important to look at the total body of work. not just what they've done in conference, not just what they've done in non-conference, but what they've done the entire season to build their resume, to make them a potential at-large candidate.
Two last questions. You've been very kind. What's something that's going to keep you up between now and Selection Sunday? Because you're not going to get a lot of sleep, all right, between now and then. There's going to be something that might keep you up. What do you think? What's something that's going to keep you up, to either to remind yourself of something, or something that you're like, yeah, I know this is something we're going to have to deal with, or whatever? What's something that's going to keep you up between now and Selection Sunday?
I think, as I've kind of mentioned before, it's I don't take this lightly. I don't take the role lightly. I don't take the leadership role that I'm in lightly. The other committee members have trusted me to lead them in the right direction. So obviously, with the great feedback we had from last year's bracket, that's a lot of pressure as well. So thanks, Sandy, for that. But we know we put in the work. We know we spend a lot of time vetting through these teams. So we just have to trust. We trust in that process. We trust in what we're doing throughout the season, that's going to lead us in the right direction come selections weekend.
Softball's been your whole life. How old were you when you started playing softball?
I actually started a little late as a pitcher. I was 12, and was on a rec team and was just asked to try pitching. And so that's what I did. And then it ended up kind of becoming my primary sport, and went on to play in college. And I was a transfer student athlete before that was an easy, cool thing to do. I like to say it was a lot harder to do back then. So played at a couple of universities, but it has been my whole life. Really excited. This is my favorite time of year. I love watching softball and being involved in the game, and just super passionate about what we can do to make, the experience for these student athletes and coaches one that they'll remember forever.
Is that something you think helps you in this process, in that you've been a player, but you also understand the administrative side, you understand the coaching side, you understand, like, you understand all sides of this? Does that help you in a lot of ways? Because you've been there. It's not like someone that, hey, they don't understand what a player's thinking about on a Selection Sunday night. You have an idea. You've been there in various ways. Does that help you, you think, in this process, that you've experienced a lot of this in different ways?
Absolutely. I think, as I said before, my time as a student athlete, and as a coach, and then now as an administrator, has shaped who I am. So sports has been a big part of my life. And, just having the passion for the game, and wanting to see good for the game, wanting to see growth in the game, that definitely helps drive, me through the stressful, tough times where it's a lot of work. I joke with my coworkers at Conference USA, this is definitely my second full-time job right now. So spending a lot of time with the NCAA staff and fellow committee members, but it's great. I have a lot of fun. We work really hard, but we play hard too. And when you like the other committee members and you have fun working with them, I think that certainly helps when you get in the room and you're making decisions. So
My last
definitely
question.
drives me and what
It
I'm doing
drives you.
today.
I could tell. That's good. My last question to you: what's the message you want to give to fans, coaches, players out there here between now and the next few years? Is there a message you want to give them out? I gave Sandy this platform, so I have to give it to you. I'm being fair.
I think, it's just important for fans and coaches and administrators to understand that we spend the time and work to get it right. And we want to get it right. And we don't make decisions lightly. And so, we're doing the best we can. We're human. So everybody makes mistakes, but we sure hope that the work that we put in throughout the season will help us to get it right come selection time and selecting those 64 teams.
That's Kelly Gatwood, Associate Commissioner of Sports Services in CUSA, the committee chairwoman of this year's softball committee. Thank you so much for taking your time. I know it's a busy time, and being so honest and just kind of educating us and giving us an inside look of what this process is like. I think a lot of fans that tune in and coaches even and have told me that they really appreciated this since we started this with Matt Larson back in 2021 and Sandy last year. Now you, so I do generally appreciate this, and we'll certainly talk down the road.
Of course. Thanks for having me.